Hello, my name is Yazen Kodmani. I manage Emirates Biofarm, UAE's largest organic farm. I will be hosting the Sustainable Action podcast for a series of episodes dedicated to agriculture and food security. Join me as we meet the producers that are leading the industry today and the innovators creating change for a more sustainable tomorrow. I'm very happy to have you here. I would love to hear more about first your background and of course SOMA Matter, your company.
Cool. Well, my background, I studied veterinary medicine before I came back to work in the UAE. I've had a career that's crossed basically the governments of Abu Dhabi as well as the federal government. And ultimately, I was in biodiversity, sustainability, and in my last 5 years was overseeing the food sector for the UAE, including foreign trade in animal, livestock, as well as plants. And that all culminated essentially in a career that sort of had me develop the primer document for the food security strategy in the UAE. In my last 2 years, I was advisor to 2 different ministers, and then realized that there was more to do, and I needed the flexibility to be able to execute that and catalyze that, and so we set up SOMA Mater.
All right, great.
Yeah.
Greg?
Yeah, my name is Greg Ohannessian. I've been in the UAE for over a decade now, and in that time I have been working both advising and working for the government here in the UAE, and working across multiple sectors from defense and education, and always working at the intersection of the public and private sector, wherever that is within these sectors. And I always felt that there was a lot of unnecessary friction between what the private sector was wanting to achieve versus the ambitions of the government, and that was a really big driving force in us building up SOMA Mater, to try and reduce that friction between the public and private sector and have them to work together towards our ambitious goals and achievements here in the UAE.
Speaking of government goals, can you tell us more about the food security strategy of the UAE?
Yeah, absolutely. When it was being developed, and now it's housed in the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment in the UAE, the strategy is really looking at the UAE as a country that currently has really a heavy dependence on imports for food, and looking at how it can work with multiple sort of partners at the federal and the local level, including the private sector, of how can we create and ensure that we have availability, accessibility, and affordability of food at all times for all individuals that are in the country. So where the strategy really focuses on how do we shift the capabilities of agriculture in the country and food production. So how can we increase our capabilities in the country? There's also a large focus on being able to get stronger research and really develop new innovative ways to either creating efficiencies or capabilities for food production in the country. The strategy is quite broad, and to that end there are sort of partnerships with the Ministry of Economy and the Ministry of Foreign Trade and the Ministry of the Foreign Ministry rather, to be able to align things, whether it's external or internal in the country, and ultimately to foster a new ecosystem of innovation to be able to produce food in the country.
Ultimately, does that, Greg, in your opinion, does that mean that we are going to produce 100%? Are we going to have our own avocados and coffee here, or?
No, and I think, Majid's point about being heavily import dependent, we are dependent on about 90% of the food that we eat in the UAE is imported. That 10% is primarily a lot of large-scale farms in Abu Dhabi and organic farms, such as your own, where we produce a really wide variety of vegetables and even fruits. I mean, if some of the viewers don't know, like, you can get some really, really good mangoes coming out of Fujairah.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of exciting production and agriculture happening in the UAE, not to mention the animal protein side. So we have a number of fish farms, as well as a number of livestock farms, from camels to goats and sheep. and even cows for dairy.
Poultry too, yeah.
A lot of poultry. So there's a very broad and it's a burgeoning sector in the UAE in terms of food production here.
You touched on 90% of the food is imported. This is a headline, of course, that's shared quite often. Do you have any thoughts on this? It comes with a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's important to understand when you're looking at a countrywide level of food in and out and the consumption levels, ultimately you're going to be able to get your accuracy from data. And data, although it is available, can sometimes be either a little misleading or, for the lack of a better word, not as accurate as you'd like. Between 80 to 90 is still, though, the ballpark of where we are. And to that end, we need to look at how we can create better capabilities in the country. There are a lot of efforts at the moment, but I think one of the challenges is there's fierce competition from international importers, farms that have different support systems across the world, and we are a logistics center in this part of the world. We have ships and planes coming from literally every corner, and to that end, with all the food that does come in, local businesses do have to either have a unique selling point or something valuable that they can bring to the market. So the goal of the strategy here is, let's see how we can nudge that. Let's go from 90 to 80 to perhaps even 70. And that's still, that 70, that 30% to produce in country is a lot at the scale of these things. But we do have capabilities, we do have technologies, and we do have know-how. And it's just about being able to create that sort of cooperation to be able to make that happen.
And I'd say there are probably two big features that we have to be aware of when we're talking about increasing local production. As Majid said, there's no way that we're going to, and we shouldn't want to get to 100% self-sufficiency. But two things that are challenges and things that need to be considered are resource scarcity, in terms of the amount of fresh water that we have, and ensuring that whatever production methods you have are as water efficient as possible, and that you're producing the highest value for every liter of water that you're using. And the second point is again something Majid touched on, is really being able to create an enabling ecosystem through policies that allow local producers to thrive in an environment where today any country around the world that can produce food can sell it here for a price that is potentially a lot lower than what can be produced here, mostly because those countries have subsidies for their farmers, which allows them to produce at much lower costs, and that's something that doesn't exist in our ecosystem yet.
Yeah, agriculture is well known as one of the most subsidized industries in the world. So for an investor, how does policy affect investability in this sector in the UAE?
I think what's important to know about policy is it can make and break some opportunities. And that's because, let's take an example. You want to invest, say, in a certain type of meat production farm, right? And when you want to invest in that farm, you say, okay, we're going to be putting all of this money in. And then you realize only after the investment that actually the product can't be sold in certain markets, or you cannot get the scalability that you require. The UAE isn't very big in the sort of grand scheme of things in the region. There are other markets that you'd want to be able to export to. So sometimes, for our own sake of sort of food security, we need to have companies that have larger markets that they can sell into. And with that, if you don't have a strong export policy, which isn't typical of the UAE because we've been so import dependent, you suddenly realize that businesses might hit a ceiling in what they can do in terms of getting to market. So policy needs to be there to be able to encourage and create better accessibility to foreign markets, whether they be local or global. Some good examples of policy that have worked really well is the access for camel milk into the US and the European market. That was very hard fought because it's very technical, but once that was established, the camel milk industry here is booming. They are creating many more products, and it's actually a novel protein or a novel milk substitute in those markets. And I think there are still a lot of products here, and I'm sure Greg will pick his own favorites, where we have capabilities in the country, we have products that we can produce that are maybe not as well known abroad, whether it's in the wider region perhaps, and definitely not in, say, Europe, far Asia or the US. So policy, encouraging the ecosystem to facilitate the growth, and then finally also getting that access externally.
I know that there are some trailblazers in this, like you mentioned camel milk and also oysters.
Yeah.
It's interesting with those cases is that maybe they find a bigger market abroad that enables them to be as sustainable and to reach the scale they need here.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, what are we, 10 million and something people in the UAE? You're going to hit a ceiling in terms of market that you can hit with maybe, say, oysters as a premium product, fresh oysters. But fresh oysters are very heavily controlled as a food product. And so the policy and some of the larger legislation that you need to be able to access other markets like Europe, very heavy consumers of oysters, and the US, same thing, and some of Asia, if you don't have that enabling policy, you kind of are like held in within the UAE's 10 million population. And for those kind of farms, scalability is important.
Can you tell us more about the opportunities? I think a lot of times we are looking at the media and maybe we hear agriculture. As soon as we hear agriculture, we think in, let's say, vegetables, or UAE has dates.
Yeah.
What other opportunities are out there, and are there things that are yet to be explored?
Yeah, no, massively. There are opportunities, as you said. I mean, everyone is thinking, oh, well, should I start a farm? But really to build a robust and sustainable ecosystem in food production here in the UAE, there are a large number of different players that need to be invested into in order to make that industry grow and this ecosystem to flourish. And a lot of that is kind of backed up by policy today through the new Circular Economy Council, who's pushing a number of initiatives through government, ensuring that everyone is aligned behind building a more circular economy here in the UAE. And one of those clear opportunities, and we were talking earlier about the amount of animal protein production here in the UAE. So a lot of poultry, a lot of fish, and a lot of big ruminants as well. And all of these, especially the fish and the chickens, they are locally produced. However, their feed is imported. So we feel good about eating a local chicken, but at the end of the day, everything that chicken was eating has been imported. So one of the things that we really think is an exciting opportunity is in insect protein that is fed on food waste. So the food waste that we have here in the UAE is fed to these insects. The insects are then transformed into a high protein meal that can then be added to the feed and becomes a local component that is being fed to local poultry and local fish. The scale of that's already needed and will be needed over the next 5 to 10 years is already massive. The amount of food waste in the UAE is massive, unfortunately. So there's a very ripe opportunity for large-scale investment into insect protein for animal feed production.
Yeah, food waste is a huge issue, especially like with COP28 coming up. So coming up with these solutions that increase circularity, I think it's important for investors to know what you said is that there's so much opportunities in the inputs, whether fertilizers, feed, seeds. As somebody in the farming industry, it's kind of difficult to operate when you're trying to do everything or importing every single thing you need, from crop protection to fertilizers and so on.
I think there's another opportunity to follow on from this, where if you look at agriculture and food, it doesn't sit, and we've alluded to this, it doesn't sit independent of itself. There are upstream requirements, there are consumables, there are things that need to go in. And to that point, that circularity, if you can continue to complete the circle, that's where you're going to have opportunities. The feed, the inputs for farms are massive. I mean, take the UAE and just multiply that across the Middle East. It's the same situation, and that's why we set up SOMA Mater. Is we want to see a more sustainable food system, and to that, we need more local capabilities to finish that circle. We can't be importing everything to feed the last mile of production, if you will. So we have resources, we have food waste and other things that are typically seen as not usable. And there are technologies now and companies that are waiting to prove and to grow by solving that circularity. And I think this is the most interesting situation for the Middle East, where in a very harsh environment, in a very limited growing environment, we need some very strong circular practices so we become super efficient. And somebody once said, one of the most efficient food systems in the world is the space station. Because there they have to conserve every bit of oxygen and water and food and waste, and it doesn't get lost in that system. They cannot afford to ship and fly more rockets up there on the regular. So taking that as a sort of analog, where we have here in the UAE a strong like desire to innovate and a need, and also the profiling of food security, I think that finishing of the circle, right? That's where that investment opportunity lies.
I think it's important you mentioned the finishing of the circle, because the consumer is the last, he's the last part of the agriculture chain.
Yeah.
And what the consumer demands, whether be it a chef or an end consumer on a retail, I think no matter what we produce, they have to actually make some different choices.
Yeah.
And
then again comes policy. So if you want to start modulating behavior, there are two opportunities you have. You either go with rewarding good behavior, or you go with punishing bad behavior. And that typically will come from policy and legislation. We're fortunate that we have strong leadership in the UAE that is very strongly emulated by the population, whether it's locals or foreigners. People who live here emulate the leadership a lot. And I'm very happy to say that when leadership picks up a cause, we can see what sometimes other countries take a long time to develop in terms of change in the society. You can see that very quickly here. But policy has to follow and be part of that. Policy gives you the bedrock and the framework by which we guide our society, and the legislation is built on. So yeah, there are still a lot of opportunities to make a difference where we see policy as part of that solution.
How many farms do we have? 20,000?
Yeah, something like 20,000 farms.
20,000 farms here in the UAE. So for a private equity firm that can bring on a really crack team of engineers, policy shapers, the opportunity for consolidation in the farm space is massive.
And it's needed. It's needed to get that scale.
Exactly. It's massively, massively needed. From farms down into logistics, I think more cold chain and more logistics for these farms, and that's something that can also be solved directly by that consolidation move. But there's a strong need for a more robust and more sustainable cold chain here in the UAE, and then food processing, right? Mm-hmm. So processing is something that we've been looking at food tech and AgTech startups across the region over the last couple of years very closely, and what we see is that there is a real lack of investment into the food processing space. We think that, with the capabilities that the UAE has, it's prime for investment into food processing. And as we start to increase our local food production, ultimately the food loss and waste is going to need a place to get looped back in, right? So that food processing is really critical for that. From food processing into retail, F&B, and sort of the last mile bit to the consumer, we face serious challenges, and particularly producers face serious challenges with the way that retail and F&B are procuring food today. If someone can come in and break that model and be able to build something that is more equitable for our farmers, that could really change the game all the way through the value loop, and really capture the attention of consumers across the region. And that's kind of everything, all the way until food waste. Food waste and going back into multiple paths like feed production, compost production,
mushroom substrates.
Yes,
substrates, absolutely.
So these are lessons from nature. Basically, nature's main input is waste, right?
Waste doesn't exist.
From trees, from plants, from animals, and that breaks down using fungus, which is mushrooms. Yeah. And then you have insects, which again, protein,
rich microorganism,
and that goes into the birds, chickens, and then that goes up to the food chain. Now, when it comes to you brought on retailers, I think the change in technology actually is a big opportunity for farmers.
Speaking of technology, I think with that loop, there's also the whole overlay of data, right? Each one of these players in that cycle will have and will be generating data, and to be able to capture that to create better efficiency from one step to the next, or to be able to divert as needed so that your processors are using more and you are losing less from the system. That was really the premise of what started SOMA as well, which was, where is all the information? Where is all the data? How can we make better policy decisions? How can we make better business decisions? And ultimately, that investment becomes more powerful when you know where to put it, right? So data as an overlay to all of this, and technology, leveraging that data. There are a lot of very interesting tech companies that are not trying to grow, but are trying to take one source and give you another, whether it's making food waste bioavailable to animals, or whether it's taking your ugly fruits and veg and making it available in another form to consumers. There are many ways that the processing industry really can do magic with what we see going to landfill. Yeah. And with that, there's just so many opportunities. Yeah. Understanding how you belong in that cycle is where it lands.
I had an experience with processing. So what happened is, if you look at agriculture nations that have historically always had agriculture, they have their own foods that are usually built on fermentation, pickling, drying, sun-dried tomatoes, and all of these products came from a need to reduce food waste and to preserve food.
Preserve food over seasons,
With the UAE being such a young nation, I feel like our processing, we cannot take their recipes, to be honest. We need to develop our own food culture, our own taste, our own...
I think what we do have as an advantage, though, is how complex and diverse we do have as a population. Yeah. Borrow from everybody, but really create your own identity. And I think with so many different players in the market, we need to go from the idea that we produce food to sell, and go from we produce food to sell, and if not, to process, if not, to preserve, if not, to find another way. Right?
Compost it.
To compost, right? And bring the cycle back. And the way I describe it is to get infinitely more tighter circles so that nothing ever leaves. First you figure out, okay, if this is going to food waste, let's see that it goes back to the plants. And then you go, you know what, some of this could actually be used to create food or feed for animals. And then you go, you know what, if this could go into bioreactors, you can create energy. And these technologies exist. It's about finding the ones that are appropriate for our region, for our country, for our environment, and also be able to innovate in those spaces. We have so many universities and research hubs that are doing different stuff. It's almost the challenge sometimes is be able to just check in with everybody to see what they're doing.
Tell me more about, SOMA Matters' vision when it comes to sustainable food production, future food production. I think with everything you've said, it's already ingrained in what you guys are doing.
The joke is, we always say we do food security and sustainability, but they're almost one and the same. Right? You cannot have food security without sustainability, and sustainability inherently means that you will have food. So sustainability we see as not only sustainability in the sort of environmental practice, but also in terms of the financial sustainability, the societal sustainability. Why it was important to tackle both those things? Food, we understand, is a core need for all human beings. And in this region where the environment is extreme, food security it preserves peace and it preserves productivity. How do we get and ensure that we have a growing food system? It's not enough just to say we could feed everybody, rice and chicken. It's like, how do we get diverse diets? How do we get people to flourish? Sustainability really shouldn't mean we just keep pace. It's about how do we grow and
maybe how to regenerate as well.
Exactly. And that's
because we have damaged the environment, so
we always take from the environment. I'm glad you've brought that up, because part of these systems where you are creating compost or other inputs for agriculture, you ultimately are trying to regenerate an ecosystem to become more productive again.
Yeah.
And with that, there have been a lot of efforts, not only on the ground, but in the atmosphere, to be able to create more conducive and more restorative agriculture. And I think that's where the super exciting stuff comes in. It's like, cool, we're now solving for feeding ourselves today. How do we grow that sustainably into the future? And to be honest, when we say this all the time, the UAE is the lab where we're going to prove that.
Yeah.
The UAE is the right platform for the world to come, prove that we can do it, and then be able to bring the solution to everybody else on the earth. And that's what we want to be part of. We want to catalyze that. That's what SOMA is here to do, to help facilitate and drive and catalyze those companies.
High temperatures, lack of soil, lack of water. What do you think, Greg, the food future of the UAE, if we are looking at the year 2050, what's it going to look like?
Look, I think what's going to be even more interesting is what the rest of the world is going to start to look like, right? And I think that's kind of the point, is that hopefully by 2050 we've cracked that for ourselves, that we've understood how to minimize our water usage in a very real way in order to produce calorifically significant foods locally, based on a circular economy that is looping back in any waste products into our food system. Circularity is key. Circularity is key, especially for us here, where we have limited natural resources. We have an abundance of sunshine, but fresh water is something that is hard to come by in a sustainable way. Building that circular system that is valorizing the food that we grow, valorizing all of the product that we produce, and ensuring that all of that is going back in. Because when we assign a true value to a cup of water here in the UAE, we immediately realize that the returns have to be much higher than what we may be producing on a conventionally grown cucumber, right? The input values that we have are misaligned with reality.
Yeah.
And as soon as we start to realize the true value of the inputs that we're putting in, that's when we realize, okay, we need to produce much more high-value products here in the UAE, and we need to minimize or eliminate any sort of waste and bring all of that back into our food system. So by 2050, I'm hoping that we'll be there, and not just that, but we'll also be rolling out the same strategies and implementations that we've had over the last few decades into the previously temperate climates where the bulk of food was being grown for us. Those parts of the world are going to start experiencing the same types of heat, the same types of drought that we experience here today. And that's why I think that blueprint that we can create here is what's so important to be able to push out to the rest of the world.
Net zero, is that a possibility in agriculture?
Net zero in agriculture will never happen until every other sector of the economy is net zero.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge that we see with net zero, and I'm excited to see what COP27 brings us in Egypt and what COP28 brings to us here at home, because I think the conversation needs to change from really just talking about net zero as an individual company or individual industry level thing. It cannot happen until the entire country is running at net zero, and that all of the countries that it engages with are also at net zero. So the ambitions are important. The ways that we need to push towards reducing our carbon footprint is critical. I think the approaches and the ways that we discuss those need to change, need to be discussed in a way that allows the private sector to recognize the value and allows the private sector to then tell the government, here are the policies that we need to unlock our potential. Here are the policies that we need in order to achieve these ambitious targets.
Food waste, of course, is a wasted resource. We talked about it as an input into insect farming, into mushrooms and so on, and compost. Do we know how much food waste do we have, and how do we collect this food waste? Where is the sources of this food waste?
So the challenge with food waste is you're going to get some numbers that have been published and that are reported, but the challenge is there is no official measuring of food lost from catering, households, and really post-consumer that you can put your finger and say, yeah, here are the numbers. So there are some assumptions, and at best we could be way off. The problem is that's only food waste, and there is food loss. And food loss is how much food you lose in the supply chain. So from the farm, what doesn't make it into the manufacturing or the retail, what's lost on the farm or in the cold storage, spoilage of things, that's a whole separate number.
Yeah.
And being able to report and capture both those numbers well is very difficult. The one thing that can be said is what does go to landfill in terms of food waste and food loss has real detrimental impact on the environment, because one, the carbon you've used and all the other resources you've used have not been consumed in the sort of end result that you were hoping for, which is for either to feed people or animals. And then secondly, when it does sit in these landfills, it off-gasses, and you have everything from methane to other gases that have a major impact on the environment. So there's a sort of layer cake of challenge with food waste, but ultimately what you can divert, you immediately can capture as resources and can be measured. I think a lot more work has to be done on the data.
Yeah. Do you think it's easier to capture food loss or food waste? Which one should the UAE be tackling?
Look, I think today, definitely food waste needs to be captured first, because 90% of our food is imported, which means that not only are we thinking about the inputs that have gone into that carrot, but also the fact that it had to get packaged into plastic, driven out to a plane, which was then flown out to Dubai and come off the plane in a truck, cold stored, into the retail shop, and finally into your fridge where it's going to shrivel and you throw it away. That chain is what we need to try and capture, right? The moment food reaches our borders, our ports, we need to be able to track that, understand how long it's been out of the ground, how long it's been on the ground in the UAE, what temperatures it's being held at, especially if we're talking about chilled meats. We need to understand all of these touch points until it reaches the consumer, or if it doesn't reach the consumer, why it didn't reach them and where it's going after that, right? Like there needs to be a very clear amount of data, not just for the government to be able to measure these and understand how to shape policy to address it, but also for every single private sector player along that chain, so that they can understand how to optimize their procurement, optimize their transport, save money by not wasting this food, right? Like so many companies are either on a rebate program or are just writing that off as an expected cost of business. So we need to try and eliminate that out of that entire process. So definitely food waste first. Food loss, as we start to increase food production in the UAE, that's another one that needs to be addressed, and that needs to be addressed through ensuring that all our farms are GAP certified, are following particular protocols, and for us to eventually build alongside, in collaboration with our farmers, we need to build policy on what happens to food waste on farm, after the farm gate, where all of that goes, how that's used, their relationship with retailers. All of that needs to be wrapped into a policy that's been built alongside the private sector, alongside our farmers.
Yeah.
I think mentioning technology is important at this stage because it's helping track the chain that you just mentioned. And then it's helping also farmers reduce that chain, reduce the length of the chain, because now they have access to technology so that they can sell their products directly to consumers, whether through e-commerce or use a lot of the platforms now that are going B2B, from farm to restaurant, and cutting out kind of the middleman, where also a lot of waste is happening at that section, the food loss there. I think farmers are very good at using the waste. So we have animals, we have soil, it's not leaving the farm. But there's one category we don't talk about, because we see waste at farmer level. We see waste in our homes and the buffets and all of that at the retail level. But I think the middleman, the traders, the distributors of fruit and veg.
Product that doesn't make it back out of the wholesale market.
Correct. Product that gets rejected at inspection points, at ports. As I understand, maybe Al Awir has 200 tons a day alone of fresh product that's being wasted. And that's not a farm, so that goes to landfill.
Yeah, that goes to landfill.
So it's quite a resource. It's quite an important resource that could be used. So in terms of best practices, we traveled recently with the Minister of Climate Change.
Absolutely, yes.
And Her Excellency Mariam Al-Maheri to the Netherlands. We visited the Horti Center.
Yeah.
Is there any case studies or best practices that you saw from the agriculture industry in that country, and of course the many other countries you have looked at, that we can kind of take some lessons from?
Yeah, absolutely. Many people will know that the Netherlands has a very strong sort of technology-driven agriculture sector. Closed shade house, closed environments, precision. We've seen a lot of those systems, whether it's drones that are taking out moths in the warehouse, which blew my mind. I was like, how does this drone tackle the moth? I was like, we just fly it into the fan.
and they had it working.
Yeah, and they had it working as well, which I thought was crazy. Yeah. But you have everything from lasers and sensors and this sort of very complex to grow these small or sometimes larger strawberries, potted plants, and flowers. But what is very well known from a food waste perspective is how the Danish have been handling food waste. Copenhagen and Denmark as a whole has had a very strong policy drive to tackle food waste. There are a lot of interesting policies that they've put out that have helped, whether it's retailers, consumers, or otherwise, work together. And this was something I remarked on our trip in the Netherlands. It's something that I admire in Denmark. There's this whole of market activity, everybody pulling together, and a natural cooperation. And I did ask how that happened, and they say, well, one, it's hard fought. It takes a long time to sort of build up that relationship with all the players, creating a platform to be able to speak on that. Israel is very well known for arid land agricultural as well, and also from a dairy perspective, they have some of the most high producing cows, as well as the Netherlands. I think you can always find a lot of these sort of benchmarks or say best practices globally. I think what's important is addressing when you bring that practice in country here, is it a tune? Is it will it run the same way? Yeah. Because what is at face value a very cool policy, something that's really effective, what might happen is the society is structured differently, or the legislators and the regulators are structured differently. And what we do at SOMA is also try to do an analysis of the ecosystem to see if something is working or not working from a policy, understanding what sort of barriers and opportunities exist. I think there are a lot of very capable countries that do a lot to cooperate and collaborate with the UAE. New Zealand is also a good example of that when it comes to technology. But ultimately, it needs the local context. So they exist out there. I'm trying to think of maybe another one where aquaculture could be a good reach for the west coast of the US, Seattle, or
think
Norway, Scotland,
Singapore with
Singapore. Yeah, absolutely.
Urban agriculture.
Urban agriculture, very good. They've done a lot of strong policies around water management, around the capability of growing in the urban environment and making that available for sale. I think one thing that's important to understand is scale does play a very big role in agriculture, and being able to scale. You need policies that enable that. And something that I think is very exciting is there may be, coming down the line, some cooperative legislation that facilitates sort of bringing together of capabilities. And the challenge there is not every person who has agricultural land is an entrepreneurial agriculturist or a entrepreneurial farmer. We've seen some and they're in the organic sector with you, some very switched on farmers that do a lot in a very small space. But when you're trying to create a burgeoning and growing organic sector, there are other things that need to happen from the government side, from the regulatory side, to give it the opportunity it needs in the market.
Food Tech Valley and many of the new projects really look at high-tech agriculture as a solution for the challenges we have in the UAE. And vertical farming has the lion's share of headlines these days. Attention, investments. Investors are looking at vertical farming to solve a lot of these challenges. What's your opinion? What's your take? Is vertical farming the future of agriculture?
The short answer is no. We cannot expect neon lights and closed environment growing lettuce to cover all our nutritional requirements. The challenge is it's very visually exciting, it's very interesting, there are a lot of robots and technology, and all of those components have a part to play in the larger food system. But you cannot assure everybody's nutrition with that alone. The majority of what we eat today is still grown in soil and still grown in different parts of the world. There is a lot, like yourself, that is being grown here in the soil. And what we need to understand is that sort of complex diet that we have cannot all be solved for with just hydroponics, just this vertical farming. And there are so many approaches alone in that. It looks good on PowerPoints. If you look at a farm, and I think this is maybe part of the challenge with the food sector, is that there's a lot of critical investment that needs to go into things that are not sexy, that are not attractive on a PowerPoint. I can show you mealworms and I can show you insect protein, and it kind of looks like an industrial facility growing grubs, right? And people are like, well, I don't want to tell my friends that, I'm now an insect farmer. But the reality is, insects play in the natural ecosystem a really critical part of taking one value into another. And the same can be harnessed, like we do with hydroponics, for the waste streams that we have. So the short answer is no, but it does have a role to play, and it continues to inform what we do in the rest of the sector. So
I think it showed actually a very successful experiment where if there's investment the policies there, then we see now that the lettuce on our shelves is local year round. We see cherry tomatoes, we see high quality tomatoes on our shelves, and that's, I think, a success.
Absolutely.
A successful experiment that we went through. Now we needed to cover the entire gamut of agriculture.
I think what happens in the tech sector is currently it's very CapEx intensive to get a facility up that really you could just do in the soil, right? If you have good agriculturalists, good farmers that know what they're doing, you can get good productivity. What the tech is doing is refining that to a surgical precision. And if the CapEx and that cost can be reduced to the point we may have where we've got a price parity or even get past that. But there are certain things that you cannot grow in those. Dates, for instance. The UAE is the largest exporter of dates in the world, simply for the fact that we have extensive farms both north and south hemisphere, and we have a trove of knowledge. There are more than 120 varietals that the UAE knows and cares for as dates. And currently in the Western world, everybody knows Bench Dual. Like that, for me, is always like a striking point where to say, well, we have a lot of asset, IP, and capability. Why aren't we, in those markets with what we know? The same goes for all the food system. We have a lot of different produce that works here in the Northern Emirates, whether it's figs, mangoes, chico, and pomegranate, and all the local fruits that we enjoy. What we need is to figure out how can we commercialize that so it's at pace with the products that we all enjoy from the globe.
And hopefully one day it won't be UAE, it won't be just dates, it won't be just mangoes, it has to be Fujairah oyster.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe our menus can say this is a Dubai omelet. Which,
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Has local eggs and then maybe some...
Like the term used in
That's it gold.
Yeah.
Not gold.
The term that the Europeans use, or the French actually, DOP, which means if you're having a cheese from that region, that's the cultural label, that's from that region.
And protected.
And it's protected, exactly. And that's where policy has grown to protect a certain capability.
I see a lot of support for local from the consumer side and from the government side.
Yeah.
So I think the protection measure to ensure that the name, the brand local, made in UAE is protected as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Organic is a huge topic these days. Organic agriculture is obviously growing on supermarket shelves. Yeah. We hear about organic, we hear about regenerative. As a consumer and from the point of policy and so on, what's your views on that?
I think there's one thing that's really important, and Greg and I talk about this often. The consumer needs to be informed. And the better informed, the better decision they're going to make at the retailer. Now, there are in the market a lot of players that will throw the word organic into their branding, but don't actually have the udwi, which is the organic certification, on their packaging, which I think is important that consumers understand that there is a standard here. There are requirements to get certified, and if you have that, that's a basic minimum. I think the other thing is also consumers are getting more conscious about what they're putting in their bodies. And so they want to pick things that they believe are good for their bodies and good for their children. And so where they can, they will want to buy organic. I think as an industry, I think it's a way forward. There's a lot of opportunity still in this region. And at the retailers, there is more and more offerings, not only from the UAE, but abroad as well.
Yeah. And regenerative agriculture, does that play a role in somewhere that doesn't have soil? Is there something to regenerate? It's
more generative agriculture.
Generative.
Right? I mean, being out at Emirates Biofarm and really seeing what years of compost can do to desert sand is astonishing, right? And I mean, you are generating soil. You're not regenerating soil. Yeah. You're making it where it wasn't before. And I think that's the magic of organics, and that's really what I think everyone needs to see to really understand, like, why is organic food more sustainable? Because you're able to leverage waste streams, you're able to leverage nature and the way that it works and use that to your advantage. It's the judo move of agriculture as opposed to conventional farms that are just brute forcing, right? Like we're going to inject as much fertilizer and we're going to use as many insecticides and we're going to create a clean slate so that we can grow what we want. It's that brute force that really, when one of the challenges that people talk about when they're talking about organics is that it's premiumized, that it's too expensive for the average consumer. When you think about it, it should be the other way around. There's so many efficiencies of scale in conventional ag today because that's just the way the system was built. But really, you think about the expense, both financially as well as environmentally, of all of these synthetic inputs that are going into the ground, stripping our soil bare. That is more damaging and more costly in the long run. And if we're able to build an ecosystem around organic farming to create those efficiencies, it will be less expensive. Yeah. And there's a lot of opportunity for investment across that ecosystem and understanding how can we deliver better inputs for organic farmers, and how can we protect organic farmers from fraud. Like this is another big issue, is that people are believing and trusting in organics, and they fetch a premium on the market for that trust, and there are players who are bringing in conventional products, labeling it illegally as organic, and fetching that delta as well. So there's a lot to be done to ensure that organics stay safe and wholesome and affordable for everyone, and that it maintains its reputation. And that's going to be better for the business people, for the investors, for the farmers, for the consumers, and ultimately for the planet.
Yeah.
I've been reading about organic success, and we're finding it really in community-led initiatives where they are demanding, because they are the first consumers and basically the stewards of their land, whether in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and a lot of communities. They are the most successful organic farmers, and it's being community-led.
So interesting, right? Because, being able to feed your community, you know exactly how much you need. You're not going to make too much food. You're not going to use an unnecessary amount of inputs. But ultimately, there's a challenge for commercially minded organic farmers, right? In order to try and compete with conventional, try and increase your yields, try and match yields with conventional, and it's a battle that's being hard fought. And I think it's also really important and good for the organic segment as a whole, because that's pushing farmers to try and be as efficient as possible with their production.
I think with the ESG reporting, we might see better value in organic farms, where instead of a snapshot of how many tons per hectare, it's how much soil was built over a period, over 10 years, versus how much destruction happened somewhere else.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Dr. Majid and Greg. We're always look forward to hearing more about SOMA Matter, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yazen.